Happy Sabbath, everyone. So good to be with you again. Um, so this study is for 2019. I put everything on the board to save time, but it's still a long message. So if you could write them down and maybe save them towards the end so we can get through the whole study. It's really she has packed a lot of information here, and it's we found it in the East Coast study relevant to hear all this again. And I did provide the board work to Elaine, so to share with you in the West Coast forum. So, on that note, um, so we have a line of progression at the top, and the idea I wanted us to see was the connection between the events from the beginning and ending of our line going to 2019 um, and the progression. So it's all about the glorious land rising up in 1798. And it's originally, if we would cut this line, it would be at 1863. And what we know what the greatest issue is and during this time period between 1798 and 1863. And slavery is the issue. It is dominating the election cycles everybody's talking about. But woven within that issue of slavery is connected the concept of American exceptionalism. And that is the belief that people have the belief that God designed to be this huge earth, that this land was ordained to be a moral beacon to the world. Um, and so,
Kathy,
yes,
when you talk to your, oh, I don't know if it's your left or there to you, not that way, the other way. You keep getting cut off.
okay, thank you. Let me get closer.
Mostly when you turn to lean and turn towards your right.
Toward my right.
Your right. No.
Oh, this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, my brand new mic that I ordered did not work. So what are the chances, right? This is a problem I always have. I apologize so much. Okay. So the notion is then that there's a moral support superiority complex, right? And the rationalization goes, since whatever our behavior, it must be justified. The mean, the end. So the 1844 election was a defining moment.
Back
Two,
over.
two parties are arguing expansion, and I may need to cut my camera off, but let me try. So there's Henry Clay and James Polk, and they each had opposing views. Henry Clay wanted to stay just the United States on the East Coast. He did not want to expand and have new territories. Whereas James Polk said, no, let's go for more land. We want Texas, Oregon, and California. And he was the one that won the election, and it decided that the United States would indeed expand. And it was the goal was to go from coast to coast, sea to shining sea, and be this great empire. So this was the discussion in the Millerite time period. Um, as I said, the issues of expansion are related to the issue of slavery. The election of Lincoln in 1860 caused the South Carolina state to secede by December 20th of 1860. And he was inaugurated in 1861, and his election, he did not win one southern state. They were all red. There were no blue states. And for the Southerners, the election of Lincoln was the final straw. They feared that his presidency would result in the end of their way of life. So as the Millerite history progressed in the 1850s, people were so agitated by this issue of slavery, and it was becoming so controversial. People were not enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. Anti-slavery organizations were increasing, and they were becoming more effective, and more people were joining them. First wave feminism was going on. So this was all rolling up for about 10 years, maybe, if you start in 1850. But at 1861, finally, the Civil War broke out, and it was over the issue of slavery. And that war was going to determine whether slavery would continue throughout the United States. We all know that the South has always rebranded their reason for fighting in the Civil War, that it was states' rights. This is a conspiracy theory. We have the spirit of prophecy telling us their true motive, and they were fighting to expand slavery. That was the purpose of the expansion to the West. They wanted more property, more states, so they can expand their slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation took effect in 1863, and it was only a beginning of the abolition of slavery, because it did not include the northern states. It was literally a military measure that President Lincoln took as the commander-in-chief to set free those enslaved by the rebellion, the states that were in rebellion. And this declaration, this proclamation, also changed Lincoln. He shifted in his views on slavery. At first, he was just totally focused, and over time, he realized, because he didn't think the Constitution gave him the right to abolish slavery. So over time, he shifted, and he did this proclamation, which was a partial abolition. And it did set a decisive course for how the nation would be reshaped after this Civil War. So, our line starts at 1798. We would cut it at 1863, but we're going to continue it on to 1989. So slavery is the issue in 1798, but many, I'm sure, have heard of the 1619 Project, and actually when the first slaves were brought to the English, and it was the Virginia colony. So it's been with this nation before the beginning and at the beginning. So prophetically, the nation, there are social. How do we relate?
Can I cut in real second? Just
Yes.
Stay to your left and you're fine. We can hear you perfectly. It never messes up, even if you're in
Right
front
here?
of the board. Yeah, because then we have the
Okay.
board work too. So if you need to go point to
Okay.
it, that's good. But if you stay there, We can hear you perfectly.
Thank you. All
I can
righty.
anyways. I hope everybody else can.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So it's rising up prophetically. There's a social and political tension as to how the nation will relate to slavery. And it's only in 1865 that it is legally abolished by the 13th Amendment. And Ellen White is going to share in the 1890s about what's going on. So this is from the Spalding Magnum Collection, page 19, paragraph 6. Quote, "There is a terrible crisis just before us, through which all must pass, and especially will it come and be felt in a particular area." She didn't name it. I'm just putting those words in. "My mind has been much troubled over the positions which some of our brethren are liable to take in regard to the work to be done among the colored people in the southern states." So basically, she's thinking about the work. She's thinking about, okay, you can't share the gospel the same way you would in the northern states. You have to change your tactics. You can be open with your thoughts in the north, but in the south, you have to teach in parables. You have to be like Jesus and cover up what you're saying. And then she goes on and says, quote, "For the same spirit that held the colored people in slavery is not dead, but alive today and ready to spring in action." So this is 1890s, 1865, we have the 13th Amendment, and this spirit is still alive and well. So she's saying we have to be careful because that spirit of slavery has not died. She continues, "The same spirit of oppression is still cherished in the minds of many of the white people of the South and will reveal itself in cruel deeds, which are the manifestation of their religious zeal." Keep that in your mind. The manifestation of religious zeal is through cruel deeds. So this story isn't just about slavery. It's a story of the United States. How does the United States view itself? How does it believe in equality? How does it view equality? And we're shown through Ellen White's writings and through history that colored people will be oppressed by cruel deeds. And those who are doing those cruel deeds are revealing their heart, and they are also the manifestation. Those cruel deeds are the manifestation of their religious zeal. So oppression goes beyond slavery, and it's involved. It's the racism that continues after the legal abolition of slavery. But all of that involving the laws and proclamations and courts and things, this is just manifestation of religious zeal. This oppression is the manifestation of religious zeal. And it's directly connected to their Protestant beliefs. So in Romans 10, verse 1 and 2, Paul writes, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge." So Paul has identified in Israel, the original glorious land, a religious zeal without knowledge. And with knowledge is discernment. So it's a religious zeal without discernment. And that lack of discernment is a incorrect understanding of God. So their Protestant beliefs, of course, they read the Bible, and there was a book written in 1864 called Southern Slavery and the Bible. And you can imagine what the argument is, right? The North, they say, this author, you must give up your Bible and your religion and adopt the South's view of slavery, because they show in this book a whole argument that the Bible shows that slavery is a biblical mandate. And they are therefore accusing the Northern people of not being Christians. They're not reading their Bible correctly. So the politics between the Northern states and the Southern states, it seems like it's all about the economy, or it looks like it's all about political power and states' rights. We don't want big government, or it's a political issue. But it really wasn't. It was actually a religious issue. It was the Protestants manifesting their religious zeal. That was the root motivation in their heart. That is their core ideology. This is a Christian nation. The Bible mandates slavery, and we stand by that. And it's a Protestant belief, and it was that zeal was not ever affected by any law that said the otherwise, or any other Bible interpretation of the Bible's looking at slavery. So when the 13th Amendment came in 1865, the zeal did not end. It just went undercover or in a different direction. So in 1890s, Ellen White shows that that religious zeal was still alive and well in the 1890s, well after the abolition of slavery. And it's called Separate but Equal, or Equal but Separate. The original law in 1890 said equal but separate. And a man was arrested he was a mixed race man. He was arrested for sitting in a rail car that was reserved for whites only. And he hired an attorney, and 4 years later, they end up in the Supreme Court. It's Plessy versus Ferguson. And the court accepted to hear the case. And but they, of course, they rejected his case, and they settled. They applied and upheld the Separate Car Act of 1890. And by doing that, the Supreme Court settled the legality of racial segregation for generations. And that was a law only in Louisiana, but shortly thereafter, it spread to other states. And it says basically, blacks are equal, but they must be separated from whites. They must have separate schools, hospitals, theaters, colleges, restaurants, doorways, restrooms, water fountain, churches, you name it. Anything in society that involved commerce or, human action, everything was segregated. So they could go to the theater, but they had to sit in the back. They were never allowed to sit up front. Things like that. Just like the buses and the rail cars and things. But can you be equal and separate? When you add the word but, you destroy equal. So again, we have our first government ordered segregation. It started in the states, and then it went to the federal. That tends to be a pattern, right? Begin in the states, and then it moves on up to the federal. So this law of segregation continued until 1951. A group of Black families wanted a better education for their children, and they decided to sue their local district to allow their children access to a white school. And they argued that there is no equality in equal but separate. It ended up eventually in the Supreme Court, and we're familiar with this case called Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. This case legally ended segregation, which is, it's on the books, it's now legal, but that doesn't change the mindset. That takes time. And there was deep, deep opposition in the southern states to desegregation. So this 1954 decision had a big impact on Protestantism. They believed they had a biblical mandate. They had Bible verses, they had chapters, they had stories. They're all there. Abraham, the nation of Israel, New Testament, all of them. They believed it was God's order that the United States be a slave-holding nation. And they used their justification of enslaving people was that, oh, we're sending the gospel, taking the gospel to them. We're going to put them in slavery, but we're going to make them go to church and they'll meet Jesus. So it's just really so hard to comprehend. But it's this Protestant mindset, this religious zeal that has continued through our history, and it has not stopped. So how were the evangelical Southern evangelical leaders, what did they think of that? Well, that ruling in 1954 did not sit well. And one of the prominent and even key leaders, Jerry Falwell, best known for crusading against abortion and homosexuality. And he was also, as we'll see, very skilled in using race to galvanize the Christian right. But he was not happy with that Supreme Court decision. And here is a quote of what he said. And he's saying this in his pulpit, to his congregation. Quote, if those Supreme Court justices and their associates had known the word of God and had desired to do God's will, I am confident that the 1954 decision would never have been made. The facilities should be separated. When God has drawn a line of distinction, we should not attempt to cross that line. And he was preaching that this segregation law that was passed was a literal violation of God's word. And so what do we see here? What is this a manifestation of? His religious zeal, the Protestant religious zeal. His mindset about segregation, about the separation of black and white, this is a manifestation of religious zealotry within Protestantism. And the ending of segregation in 1954 literally mobilizes the religious right in America. Falwell continues his sermon. The true Black person does not want integration. He realizes his potential is far better among his own race. He announced that integration would destroy the white race eventually. No one northern city, he warned, that a pastor friend of his was already living next door to an interracial couple. He sees this as starting to happen not only in schools, but now they're starting to live next door. He sees the destruction of the white race, and this escalates through the 1960s, the civil rights movement within America. Then he begins to start attacking Martin Luther King as a communist subversive, calls him a left-wing propagandist. So he goes from preaching in the church to warning his members, and now he's outwardly attacking the civil rights leader. And he eventually realizes he's not making any political impact. He's not having one at all on the civil rights movement. It was too big. It had too much power. And so he retreats from politics and he goes silent for a while. So he's not just laying around. He's been busy while he's not been out there politicking. He creates a Christian academy. And it's a private school. It's for white students only. And so his thinking is, well, I can't make political change. I'll bypass the law. And so he also said that that this law of segregation applied only to the public schools and that private schools were exempt from segregation. He wasn't the only one that started their own schools, but the goal was to make sure their Southern Christian communities in the South were able to enact segregation, which he would say is his religious right. So we see this temperament, this mindset, this enactment of religious zeal continues on. So in 1976, the IRS revoked the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University based on their discriminatory admission policies. And they had been warned for years that they had to not keep those policies, that they were to integrate their campuses. And the university actually lost their court case, and the Supreme Court said, nope, you cannot be tax exempt if you discriminate racially on your policies. And Falwell was furious. He was out of his mind and extremely angry that anybody could lose their tax exemption just over segregation. What's with that? So this was another catalyst. This united the religious leaders together. And it was Bob Jones, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell Sr., and Paul Weyrich. And they all began in the early 70s to unite over this issue. And so their plan was they want to influence the government. So if we can't sidestep it and create our own schools, if we can't enact our religious beliefs driven by our religious zeal, we need to influence the government to take over the system. And so Falwell started promoting the notion that the US Constitution was the will of God, and that the country it governed was special in God's eyes. And so this is what Falwell, decades ago, set the stage for today's Christian nationalism. So it's like a seed, this is in the 70s, and then it takes time to grow. So Paul Weyrich, I don't know if you've looked into him or not, but he's quite the mastermind in this religious right movement. So he has created a lot of nonprofits. The one that is currently in the news is a Heritage Foundation that he created back in the 70s. Excuse me. So these religious leaders started having meetings, and they started creating an agenda, and how are they going to impact the government, and how are they going to bring the government around. I mean, they want them to. It's like we need to have them believe that this is a biblical mandate, that this nation is a Christian nation. And And Wayrick said that this was a holy war and that their mission is to lead the nation back to the moral stance that made America great. But in order to do that, they had to form a new political philosophy, and they packaged it in non-religious language. It had to look secular, political, not religious. And then they could wield influence over the people who govern them. So there was a time that prior to the 70s, evangelicals did not participate in politics. They just didn't do this. But that changed with the advent of the moral majority in 1979. They felt more connected to this history. And of course, at that time in the 70s was the civil rights, women's rights, gay rights movements happening. But the issue that united them was the issue of segregation. And so that's was the driving issue for them. And I'd like to quote Randall Balmer. He's a professor of religion at Dartmouth College. He also recently produced a documentary called Bad Faith. I think it's like on YouTube somewhere, or you might have to rent it. I'm not sure. I can't remember how I saw it. Probably had a free Prime thing, but anyway, back to this. So here's what he says. For the first time in any significant way, evangelicalism becomes interlocked with the Republican Party. They are not just working with any politicians. Once they begin this political movement, they are targeting one party, and that party is the Republican Party. They become interlocked, and you see an alliance develop between them, between Ronald Reagan and the evangelical leadership known as the moral majority. So this politically, the moral majority is active for 10 years. They accomplished their agendas. The first thing they want is to get Ronald Reagan elected. They got that in 1980. The next step was George Bush. They got him in 1988. So they now have officially united with the Republican Party. They've put two presidents in power, and they believe that those two presidents will enact their political agenda. By 1989, the 10-year movement dissolves, and Jerry Falwell says that the moral majority is firmly in place, and they will continue to impact politics for the generations to come. And he's right. So another quote from sociologist Martin Riesbrot. He says, scholars have argued that movements such as the moral majority were patriarchal protest movements intended to reestablish the leadership and authority of males in their families, in government, and religious institutions. The emergence and popularity of the moral majority came at a time when there was growing efforts to establish the rights of women, people of color, and the LGBT community. The moral majority drew primarily from white fundamentalist and evangelical Christians, although it also included conservative Catholics and mainline Protestants. It thus mobilized a broader conservative religious and political coalition than just white conservative evangelicals. Throughout its 10 years of existence, the moral majority became a decisive and powerful force within conservative politics and the Republican Party. Falwell and the moral majority worked with other equally conservative, evangelical, and fundamentalist Christian leaders, such as James Dobson, Tim LaHaye, Pat Robertson, Phyllis Schlafly, and others. Ultimately, this broad coalition of conservatives, mostly white Christians, came to represent the religious right. And he concludes by saying it has had an enormous impact on both the Republican Party and on public policy since its founding, which would be 1979. So the Republicans are noticing what's going on. They see the candidates in the religious right as a voting bloc, and they routinely go visit them at their institutions, and they attend meetings, and they are invited to speak at different events. And so the efforts of the moral majority and the other organizations, they got together and were able to, especially Phyllis Schlafly, to defeat the legislation on the Equal Rights Amendment, which was an amendment to be added to the Constitution, declaring that men and women are equal and should have equal rights. They also blocked legislation favoring LGBTQ rights. Similar issues echo today, which she refers as 2019, and we can say today in 2024. These issues are presented in the guise of religious freedom for Christians. Think back the bakery, not making a cake for a gay couple, Hobby Lobby, not having birth control in their insurance program. There was another one, a website, a woman didn't want to create websites for gay people. And this is all based on their religious freedom. So Falwell now, having been prior to 1979, was not involved in politics. And now that he has moved into politics, he's got to shift his theological perspective. And so he moved from a separatist stance that said God controls everything, including politics. So he moved into another perspective that says, oh, well, human action is required to fulfill God's intended destiny for America, which fits right in with American exceptionalism and their religious zeal. So prior to 1979, God controls everything, I'm staying out. But now, after 1954, the decision on integration, he sees that God is going to control politics through God's people, which of course is the Christian right. And so Christians have to be active if we wish to fulfill God's will for the nation. So he's now stirring up his base, his Christian congregations and followers. He's stirring up their religious zeal. So Falwell Sr. died in 2007. And his son took over running the ministry and the university. He's Jerry Falwell Jr., and they were cut from the same cloth. They have the same combining of religious and political commitments. And Falwell Jr. continued the conservative Republican thinking, and he was just the spitting image of his dad in those respects. So there was a quote after in 2016 that referred to Falwell. So it says, recent scholarship argues that the white Christian America, upon which the religious right remains dependent, is in decline. But yet, in the 2016 election, 81% of them voted for Donald Trump. This makes Jerry Falwell Sr. and his legacy as important a figure for the Republican Party as Ronald Reagan. So here we have, everybody loves Ronald Reagan, and now we've got Jerry Falwell Sr. that they are both like pillars in the on the right, in the Republican Party and in the religious right. So one of the things Elder Tess brought up was the our focus on the papacy during the 1979-1989 era, and that some were slipping into conspiracy theories in their mindset, and that there was a possible secret alliance that really wasn't secret. We know John Paul II was there. Some suppose there was a Black Pope, there was some cult action. But the point is that we were making that time period all about the action of the papacy. And yes, there was an understanding of John Paul's role in that history. But that has not impacted our present reform line as much as the rise of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. We were so blind, we were too blind to see the Protestantism in this history. We were focused on Catholicism. And if you miss the Protestant history that brought us to 1989, that 10-year period, then we're going to miss the history of what's leading us to 2019. So our reform line, we have two presidents, Reagan and Bush, 1989, Reagan ending, Bush beginning. Moral majority brought us to 1989. The morality of the so-called majority decides to enforce their morality on the minority, quote, through politics. So you can trace Jerry Falwell Sr. through this history. And he endorses Ronald Reagan, 1980. He helps get him elected. And so now we want to look, we want to connect Donald Trump to this story and look at our waymarks and see where he is in this story. So when we come to the history, especially 2014, we see the Republican Party and the evangelical right, but you also see Donald Trump. And those two paths merge into one, and you can trace them into the 10-year period. And we're going to look into that eventually, but we're going to get there. But first, we're going to look on to 1996. Falwell goes on a tour of America, and he is encouraging pastors to become politically active. So this is a political tour. But what do we see now? When we see these political tours and get politically active, we know what's motivating that. It's their religious zeal, right? So get those pastors, and then the pastors will get their congregations politically active also. So he's going on this bus tour, but he has a problem. Their views are too extreme. They're pro-segregation, anti-feminist, anti-gay, anti-civil rights, and they're not winning anything. They're losing this battle, and nobody wants to go that way. They're just too extreme. So they eventually changed their tone, and it shows out later. They, they do drop the racism, and they pick the other two targets of feminism and homosexuality. But in the meantime, they are not happy with Reagan and Bush, whom they worked to put into the presidency. They're not enacting the vision that they had in mind. Reagan was good, but not good enough for Jerry Falwell. And they were having to reevaluate their agendas and their game plan. And then along comes terrorist attack in 2001. So what's the standard evangelical response to a terrorist attack or something, a crisis, a disaster that happens? They blame the attacks because of America's acceptance of feminism and homosexuality. They didn't include race. See, they had changed their tactics, right? They figured it out, but they could still go for feminism and homosexuality because they've got biblical verses to back them up. Billy Graham's daughter said that God has abandoned us as a nation. No, that the United States has abandoned God as a nation. He's withdrawing his favor, its punishment because of our immorality. And we told God to get out of our politics, get out of our schools, get out of our businesses, out of our marketplace, and off the streets. And so that was a similar opinion voiced by her brother, and both of which are children of Billy Graham. Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, they responded on television saying that it was an angry God that allowed 9/11 because the nation had become abortionists, homosexuality, secular schools, secular courts, formation of the American Civil Liberties Union. And they were saying that this attack on the United States was just the beginning of the judgment of God. So there's an external disaster, and it's considered a judgment of God. Then there's a weather disaster, and the same thing happened. This was Americans need to repent. And this one pastor was focusing on a pro-LGBTQ mayor in Houston. And he said, God is judging that city. This is why you're having all these natural disasters. And so this is their regular playbook so that they can have their religious zeal pointing out the error of everyone else in the country because look what happened to us, it's your fault. So we see that in 1996, the governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, he went on Fox News and said, the reason that there's a school shooting is the fault of our culture. There we go again, religious zeal. And the fact that we have a culture in which we say there is no God. It's not about the fact that everyone has guns. It's the fact that we have said there is no God, and we have hate inside the heart, and we have lost our morality. So everything is all the judgment of God because of a loss of morality. So we come to, so we go through the Reagan presidency, the Bush presidency, then there's Clinton and Bush Jr., and then the history of 2008, and Barack Obama is elected president, the first Black president ever elected, and this is their worst nightmare. They are not achieving their political change. How on earth did this happen? They had a plan. They were united with the Republican Party. They had their Republican candidates. And, they've been at this since 1979. And so they're the Bush presidency actually was when a financial crisis began, and then Obama was elected in 2008, but he didn't take office till 2009. So by the time President Obama is in office, the financial crisis is at its peak. Hundreds of thousands of people are losing their homes, their mortgages are upside down, people are losing their jobs. I think at one point it was 800,000 jobs per month were being lost in 2008. So that financial crisis was a turning point for the Republican Party because there was the beginning of a movement within the U.S. House of Representatives, and it's known as the Tea Party. And it was the response to that financial crisis. And the Tea Party movement is a Republican movement within the Republican Party, but it's right wing. And so this financial crisis brings together particular extreme right-wing elements of the Republican Party, and they unite. So here's a quote from the Washington Post about the Tea Party. One important group blazed the path that Trump has followed, and that's the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement, in substance and style, Trump realized that the agenda that the movement, those Republicans, had forged from 2009. And what distinguished the Tea Party Republicans in the House was not their views on fiscal issues, but their views on social and racial issues. House members mostly aligned with the Tea Party were more socially and racially conservative than other Republicans, and it arose as a fringe wing of the Republican Party. So this isn't just about economics. What's uniting them is social and racial issues. He continues, its ideological underpinnings are often described as opposing government intervention in the economy. And yet it was also aligned with the conspiracy theory regarding Obama's birth. So there's a quote of a historian who studies politics. He studies the politics of American financial crises. And he said that the Tea Party movement is precisely the type of fringe group that often rises up in the wake of an economic calamity. He said that after major panics, conspiracy theories can flourish and elevate extreme politicians who seek to paint their political opponents as the root of the pain felt by voters. Political parties always sort of had plausible deniability when it comes to these fringe organizations, but these fringe organizations have a great deal of power. And these fringe groups are the things to look at if we want to understand what our future will look like. And what do we have? What if we had a fringe, crazy House of Representatives, really on the outside edges? Another quote from a Washington think tank. Trump blamed the financial crisis on the secretive insiders who run the government, the deep state, But he also had another target, the immigrants. Resentment against bankers wasn't the only line that Trump picked up in his campaign for president. No one is claiming immigrants had anything to do with the financial crisis, but that was a most effective line of attack that he had. And he's very opportunistic. So the right wing within the Republican Party, the Tea Party, they come together in 2009. And what characterizes them is the conspiracy theories. So this is not just about economic policy. Remember, it's social, racial, and conspiracy theories in these fringe groups. And you can see in that history that Donald Trump begins to question Obama's birth, saying he actually wasn't an American citizen. He was born in Kenya. Nobody's seen his birth certificate. He just kept dredging that up more and more. And the more often he said it, the more popular he got, and he got more responses from people. So fringe movements have their basis in conspiracy theories, race, and social issues, and that was particularly regarding Obama. And that fringe then begins to pin the blame for the country's economic war on immigrants. We're all familiar with that, history repeats. And when the economy in Germany collapsed in the late 20s, early 30s, what did Hitler say? How did he use that disaster, that financial crisis? He used it for his own political agenda, saying that the economic trouble that was within Germany came from who? The Jews. So he used conspiracy theories to wield political power and to manipulate people. And so just as this quote previously had said, it's when crises form that fringe groups can rise up, and that one person would be elevated who will then use conspiracy theories to manipulate people. And we have a lot of history to show that. Another quote. Indeed, the financial crisis made Americans more comfortable expressing views that were anti-immigration, according to a study published in the International Migration Review in July. Post-election survey data suggested Trump's appeal was mostly due to the fear of cultural displacement among white working-class voters. Another study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences also says that the economic anxiety narrative is also part of that. The findings suggest that white Christian male voters turned to Trump because they felt their status was at risk. And that is the exact same issues that they were struggling with in the 1979 history, when they were finding their status at risk. Excuse me. So the Republicans and the religious rights biggest nightmare happens, and President Obama is reelected. They swore it would never happen again, and they set about to try and find the perfect candidate. So these fringe elements come together and they say, essentially, whatever it takes, we can't have another Democrat in the presidency. They want a conservative Republican. And so from 2012, we have Steve Bannon and what he would call the Judeo-Christian West. They all began to mobilize and prepare for the next election cycle. So we've had numerous studies, and we've seen Steve Bannon's work in history, but it really is the mobilization of the Republican Party in 2012, and they began working with the Cambridge Analytica and SCL, Strategic Communication Laboratory, and these companies are already attempting to use this particular white Christian male population to use race and social issues to their advantage, to manipulate the public in voting for their own agenda. And I think that's Facebook was involved in that 16. So 2014 turning point. Obama was trying to separate church from state, but in 2014, Steve Bannon is at the Vatican speaking. He's a very strong conservative Catholic, and he says that we are at the beginning stages of a brutal and bloody conflict. We will have outright war against jihadists. He talks about Islam, the secularization of the West, socialism, atheism, the left, and he says we are at war with all of them. And this is all at the beginning of a populist revolution. So we know in 2014 internally, a message is unsealed. We don't really see it yet. It has to grow. And this is what's happening with this beginning of a populist revolution happening in 2014. Can't really see it yet. So Trump fits into this narrative starting back in 1979, when a journalist did a pretty deep dive in examining Trump, his personal life and his business practices. And of course, nobody would be surprised that the articles were not favorable. But even before the conclusions were given, Trump was aware that this man was doing investigations about him and was going to write these articles. And Trump called him, and he handled this journalist like he does everybody else. Apparently, this is his moda operandi. First of all, he threatened the journalist that he would sue him and destroy him if he said anything negative. And then he turned around and said, but if you write favorably about me, I can get you an apartment and you wouldn't have to live down here in Brownsville, which apparently was a poor district. I will get you an apartment in one of my units. So, of course, this was put in the report and the article. And he said, the author said, Donald Trump had the bribery and the threat. He had the carrot and the stick. And this is how Donald Trump is working the media from his very inception. He's either bribing or threatening. And we have seen that ever since his election. I mean, so many people said they just don't speak up because they are fearful of what Trump will do. Okay, so another part of his article, this is the first one, 1979. In this, the first of two parts, he's going to examine the character and history of Trump's Brooklyn base, and then he's going to trace the details of his business practices. And he says that each of these, this Brooklyn empire, the Manhattan purchases, and the government contracts, is a tale of overreaching and an abuse of power. And like his father, Donald Trump pushed each deal to the limit taking from it whatever he could get and turning political connections into private profits at public expense. And he will be like, he'll connect with a political officer, like a mayor or a county official, somebody that has some power. And he'll say, look, I want to build a property on this building on this property, and I want $50 million in no taxes, or save 50 million on taxes over the next 20 years or something like that. And so that then is a loss for the public, but it's a financial gain for him. And he does this repeatedly. And the political connections he inherited from his father. The other 2 points of this investigation by this man notes that how Donald Trump leases his properties. If you go in and you call and you want to rent an apartment, they take your name, and somehow they are able to determine what color you are. And if they think you're black, they put a little C next to your name for colored. This was back in the day, early 60s and 70s. And so here we show racial discrimination. And eventually his father and himself were sued by the government for segregating their apartments, for not wanting to lease to black families. And they lost that suit. Although he says he won, but he lost. They had to pay a lot of fines and not segregate. The other issue is when you want to rent an apartment and you come in, they want to know, well, do you make enough money? We need to see your earnings. But they only want the earnings from the man, not the woman, regardless of whether or not she works, especially if she works. They don't even want her income. So this makes it difficult, right? If you're a woman, you walk in there and you go like, I'd like to rent an apartment. It's not going to happen. You have no hope. He only counts the men. And so we can see how what he thinks of women. So he started having political ambitions, overtly dropping clues in 1988. And he was having an interview with Oprah Winfrey. And he started talking and complaining in that 1988 history. He was complaining about the very same things that he complained about in 2016, which he complained about in 2020, and which he's still complaining about in 2024. The American allies aren't paying enough. We're being ripped off by China. The Japanese are living in the lap of luxury while we protect them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Oprah says to Donald Trump, well, what you're saying sounds like presidential talk. He goes, oh, no, I probably won't run for president, but he wouldn't rule it out completely. But he said he is tired of American allies taking advantage of them. And he goes, and America would make a lot of money if I was president. And after his first, this wasn't in the study, but I thought about what they discovered about how much money Trump made while he was in the White House. And I think that sentence should be, I will make a lot of money if I was president, because everything is a personal profit for him. He's got to find a way to make money. And that's just his MO. So anyway, this is the first hint of political ambition, and Oprah picks up on that. And then in January 1989, his first cover on Time magazine. Okay. So there were 2 journalists in 2019 that had the same thesis. I don't know if they knew each other, but they took different approaches. And the question was, how did we get to 2019? One author said, because of 1989, the decisions of 1989. The other one said, no, it's the decisions of 2014. So we're going to look at the first article that spoke of 1989. The present situation arises out of a past that we are too quick to forget, misremember, or enshroud in myth. But where we are today in 2019 is because of past choices. Different decisions back then might have yielded different outcomes in the here and now. Donald Trump ascended to the presidency as a consequence of many choices that America has made over the course of decades. Although few were made with Trump in mind, but he is the natural result of the choice America has made. Where did Trump come from? How can we account for his presence as commander-in-chief and leader of the free world? So then it continues. They take us back. They take us to 1989, and it's the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War winds down, and members of the Washington elites or the smart people, think tank people, declare that the opportunities presenting them went beyond merely stupendous. The US is the world's superpower. Liberal democratic capitalism is destined to prevail everywhere. There is no way except the American way. And this exuberance of the fall of the Soviet Union and the I guess this increase of self-esteem and this joy of victory and America great thing, when instead the author thinks that at the end of the Cold War, it should have caused them to reflect about the many mistakes and moral compromises that America made from the 1940s through the 1980s. But they had no interest in revisiting their mistakes, and certainly no remorse or contrition. Instead, they became controlled by an extraordinary hubris and a patent of reckless behavior informed by an assumption that the world would ultimately conform to the wishes of the indispensable nation, the United States of America. So what this author is showing in this history is what? American exceptionalism, the end of the Cold War. And that's what's driving them, is this conception, this concept that the United States is the one world superpower. We will define what that looks like. But Maggie, sorry, Maggie. So sadly, they made the wrong choice in the slavery history. Remember, they had American exceptionalism, expansion, manifest destiny, and now here we are, the United States again, at the end of the Cold War, is making the wrong choice. And Reagan, in regard to this exceptionalism, more than anyone before him, took that point of American exceptionalism the furthest, and he called America a city on a hill. And he took that from a century-old speech on how America is this exceptional nation sitting on the hill looking over the world. Can you not get a bigger superiority complex than you putting yourself, we are the one on the hill, we are the city, we are the beacon. And Reagan was very popular. So 1989, we can also, of course, discuss Trump. He's on the cover of Time magazine. We trace him in that history. In 1989, his first wife accuses him of rape, which is going to be a pattern of abuse that we will see throughout his history. His next accusation of rape is 1996. There was an interview with Trump. He had purchased the Miss Universe organization, and he was in an interview, and the woman who had won was with him. And in that interview, right on TV, he began to attack her weight. And he called her an eating machine. And he just kept destroying her. And people still talk about that. I think it's still available somewhere, but it was really bad. So this history of, race and women, gender, is clearly part of his history and the makeup of this man. The other interesting thing in 1996 is that Trump united with an American company, and they were making plans to build a hotel in Russia. And so this is where people who are researching his connections go back to this point, and they're still trying to find out what exactly happened in Russia, because the plan fell apart. But that's the starting point when people trace Russia and Trump together. He briefly ran for president in 2000. He pulled out of the race. And so he would have been president in 2001 if he had won. Wow. Okay, so he didn't, he pulled out. So then there's the 9/11 attacks. And so it's a disaster, right? And he talks about how he was there. He saw the horror of it all, people falling out of buildings, but he was 4 miles away from the building. Much of it has been disproven. Most everything he said was a lie. But interestingly, those kind of disasters, like we have shown previously, these kind of people take advantage of, and it tries to stir their base and create this cult of personality. These conspiracy theories are just like the burning fuel for these people. So in 2009, Trump joins Twitter, which that changed Twitter. He changed politics like we've never known. But the other thing that happened in 2009 was that he registered as a Republican. And in 2009 is when President Barack Obama was inaugurated as president. And so we can conclude that it was his response to a Black president being elected in 2009. Because there's evidence that he has donated mostly to Democrat Party from 2001 to 2009. And he was a registered Democrat in that time period. So, and then in 2012, he really started supporting the Republican Party. So also there was a Trump meets this man named David Bossie, who worked he worked against the Clintons. He fueled conspiracy theories against Hillary and Bill Clinton, and it was done intentionally by the right-wing Republican Party. And but Trump meeting Bossie enabled Trump to meet Bannon. So Bossie introduces Bannon to Donald Trump. And in 2011, Trump is thinking about another bid for the presidency. And he meets with the evangelical leaders and they say, the time is not right. Trump meets with Bannon. The time is not right. So that's 2011. 2013, he goes, okay, maybe I'll run for governor. And he meets with Republicans. They have this proposal, this concept, and say, look, if you run for governor of New York, stay there for a couple years, and then we can, get you into the for a presidential bid. And so that was in December of 2013. January 14, a number of political operatives meet privately with Trump. And the chairman of the Conservative Party for a certain county brought the necessary papers for Trump, and that would help to form an exploratory committee for him to run as governor. And Trump was considering the idea, but he told the man, he goes, I want all the other political opponents, all the other people running for the same position to drop out of the race. And they're like, we can't pave the path for you straight to the governor's office. You need to run like an ordinary regular candidate. And well, that really ticked him off because, he's not an ordinary person. And so he pulled out of the race for governor. And then he heads to Twitter and he gets his Twitter fingers going, and this is what he writes. While I won't be running for governor of New York State, a race I would have won, I have much bigger plans in mind. Stay tuned. Will happen. So 2014 is a turning point, and here he is planning his political career, but not as governor of New York. He has bigger plans in mind. 2014, Cambridge Analytica, Steve Bannon, Fox News, the Republican Party, the right wing of the Republican Party, and the Tea Party movement, they all began to unite with the evangelical right. So you've got this perfect storm happening in 2019. It's not totally visible. There's not any big action yet, but these groups are all coming together. And they're looking for their ideal candidate. And so the messaging with Cambridge Analytica is sending out political messaging. Of course, it's the same issues of race and gender and what their vision of what the United States is meant to look like. So an article written in 2017 says, a year into President Trump's first term, I've been trying to answer the question about the question, Donald Trump, when was America's emotional table set for his election? And he says, so Trump has been driving the American political conversation in one way or another for a while, ever since he came down the golden escalators in 2015. But I think the real emotional buildup to Donald Trump started before he appeared on that escalator. It all starts in 2014. People have many theories why Trump won. Racial resentment, economic anxiety. But in 2016, this author is saying, Donald Trump turned the campaign into something deeply personal for all Americans. It was a referendum on our national self-worth. Were we really great, or were we in need of greater improvement? And Trump brought out our sentiments of fear, of loathing, and hope in a way unfamiliar to our sober, straight-laced politics. Of course, the results of the 2016 election can't be traced to just one year. There are many events, but the sentiments of people grow and change year over year. But a series of events can also surface strong feelings in a group of people and feed the idea that change is in the air and that Americans self-presumed exceptionalism has atrophied. So here we have, again, a sense of American exceptionalism, and it's feeding the base. They get it. Trump tied into that and figured it out. This author continues. Perhaps that's why the themes of fear and mortality that hovered over the 2016 election made some sense with 2014 in the rearview mirror. It's hard to tell how long it takes for an emotional response to get into the political bloodstream of a country. But when pricked by the right needle, America's righteous anger and primal worry bled out into an election. And he lists some events of 2014. Black Lives Matters, racial issues, America entering Syria, Russia entering Ukraine, ISIS and what they did in 2014 to their captive American citizens. He said all these issues in 2014 affected the United States' self-esteem. These events have caused the American public to question their American exceptionalism that they were promised in 1989. And they find the candidate who promises to bring it back. So we have a parallel of internal and external history. We have the movement message, and external, we have Trump and the Republicans and the religious right. The movement does not start as an organized structure. It takes time to grow and develop. Same can be said about the external. Those events happened in 2014, but it takes time to develop. The movement, the uniting of the Republican Party, the evangelical right, begins in 2014. It begins to grow and swell. You can begin to identify external leadership, Donald Trump. Then you have him elected, but restrained. He starts taking over branches of the government. He begins taking over other offices and the role of attorney general. It all begins in 2014, but it has a work of escalation. So it's just as it's identified in the article about what led Donald Trump to 2019 begins in 2014. So these events of 2014 come together and they developed into Donald Trump's candidacy and election. So we became organized. We became organized in that history. And they became organized in that history. But behind all of that, whether it looks political or not, is what? Religious zeal. The problem people are having is that they cannot identify in the current politics of America that it is a result of the religious zeal of the evangelical right. And what Donald Trump is enacting is the morality of the majority, as he has taken over the Supreme Court and he has done more and more, taking away rights of women, taking away rights from those who identify as LGBTQ, taking away rights from races. Civil rights are under threat. Black lives are under threat. Immigrants are under threat. All of those issues we can find in 2014. And if we want to, we can even go back to 1989. So as we come to a close, we are led to the Great Controversy, chapter 38. And it's page 610.3. So long as Jesus remains man's intercessor in the sanctuary above, the restraining influence of the Holy Spirit is felt by rulers and people. It still controls, to some extent, the laws of the land. Were it not for those laws, the condition of the world would be much worse than it is now. So we know the Constitution is, and the laws of the land are being broken. But Ellen White is saying there is a restraining influence felt by the rulers. The impeachment shows that they are using the laws to restrain Donald Trump. So these laws are still enough to, at this time in 2019, to hold Trump from enacting these powers, religious right, the Republican Party and Trump, from enacting their dictatorship. However, we have a crucial 2024 election coming up, and we'll see how well those laws hold up. So another quote from the Great Controversy is, she talks about there's been active agents of Satan, and God has agents that are among the leading men and women in the nation. And the enemy moves upon his people to propose measures that would impede the work of God. But the legislatures, they work on restraining or holding back that current of evil. And so basically, Ellen White's identifying two streams of information. There are God's agents and Satan's agents. And these two groups within U.S. politics, God's agents and Satan's agents, they are pulling from two opposite ends. One is trying to bring a current of evil, and the other is trying to hold it back. And this is literally a tracing of the events of an internal civil war. And we predicted, that's why we were able to predict in October 2018, there would be an impeachment, because one side is working to restrain the tide of evil. So by Ellen White is identifying two streams of information, and those who are God's agents are putting restraint on Donald Trump in that history. So the work of the moral majority, they were able to bring about the election of Reagan and Bush, 1980, 1988. And the article that we read previously was about being, led, that these things were developing because of 1989. That this was a patriarchal protest movement between 1979 to 1989. That protest, that moral majority, is what led us to 1989, because Reagan got elected, and Reagan was the one that was at the time of the end working to the downfall of the Soviet Union. And so these, the moral majority represented the conservative religious reaction to the efforts of those three major movements of civil rights, women's rights, and gay rights. And these are all manifestations of their religious zeal that led to 1989. And she also, we want to point out that the Catholics were there. There was involvement by the Catholics. It's not just evangelicals. Steve Bannon is united with a very conservative faction of the Catholic Church, as is, well, in current history, so is J.D. Vance. The effects of the moral majority and other important organizations within the broad religious right, including focus on the family, defeated the equal rights movement, amendment, and they also blocked equal rights for civil rights, gay rights, women's rights. And they did it all in the guise of religious freedom for Christians. They, excuse me, they claim it's their religious right to own slaves. It was their religious right to segregate. It was their religious right to dictate their morality on the minority. Quote. All through this history, you have them argue that this is their religious right to hold these principles. And it's always the same argument, and it's always connected to their religious zeal. It is not wholly political argument. Falwell led to Reagan, led to Bush. 2015, Jerry Falwell Jr. led to Donald Trump. He endorsed him, just like his father endorsed Ronald Reagan. They followed the same pattern. They followed the same mindset. And that same mindset brought us Donald Trump in this history. It's what began our reform line at the very beginning. And it's the same issues that have galvanized them. It's the same issues of equality, not just race, which is evident through the right-wing movements, but it's their issues of equality when it comes to gender and when it comes to homosexuality that leads us to 1989 and what led us to 2019. We have been accused of being a political movement, but what those who accuse us that they have not identified is that these are race issues. These are a manifestation of the religious zeal of a Protestant church or a Protestant belief. And what we are seeing today under Donald Trump is the exact same thing, the religious zeal of the Protestant conservative movements. So what we expect to see when we come to 2019, Ellen White reminds us of our place in history. We talked about the impeachment. We put on our prophetic glasses and see what God's doing. And we realize it's a fulfillment of a prediction made in 2018. And what we are seeing fulfilled is of the great controversy, where God's agents, those politicians working as a restraint against the current of evil, they fulfill a prophecy that goes back beyond 2018. And when you are willing to identify it as such, you have to identify two streams of information and which agent represents which master. Let's close in prayer. Holy God, we praise you and thank you, Lord, for this amazing journey that you have brought us. The truths that you are opening up, the light that we have shining inside our minds and our hearts to see this great controversy unfolding, and we are in the midst. We are not only participants and observers, but we testify to these experiences. Lord, we thank you so much for these opportunities to be together, to study on your Sabbath day, to fellowship, to worship you. Lord, continue to lead and guide and direct us, and we thank you for the light you have given us. In Jesus' name, amen.